this site. Here I want to give a little bit more of an in-depth view of some of the structure of what's gone on in these smear campaigns. And I want to do it through the writings of Wilhelm Reich. Wilhelm Reich is one of the great figures of our time. He was a student of Freud. I have never studied his writings intently. I have followed him in a kind of loose way, but I feel connected to him, right, in some significant manner. Much of my teaching is about a new vision of Eros, a new vision of relationship, of erotic possibility, of a new vision of sexuality, a new sexual narrative. And my life has been, in many ways, playing with the fire of Eros, playing with new possibility, trying to understand the relationship between the erotic and the holy, teaching a new vision of sexuality. And in the coming years, I want to focus an enormous amount of my effort on teaching both about a new vision of politics and economics, which parallels a new vision of relationships, of sexuality, of family, of Eros. And the two are inextricably related, right? They can never be separated. Reich had a similar vision. I came to Reich, in a serious way the first time a decade ago, when a teacher in the Jewish renewal movement suggested that I read Reich's book, The Murder of Christ, and his book, Little Man, right, to understand what had happened to me 10 years ago when I suffered the false complaints in Israel. And I read Reich. I read Listen, Little Man. I read pieces of his book, The Murder of Christ. And then, right, a close colleague, friend, my beloved collaborator, Christina Kincaid, also refocused me, right, on the work of Reich. And both this teacher 10 years ago and Christina pointed to a particular passage, right, in Reich, which is important. And it captures what I would call the underlying dynamic. It's not the only dynamic. It's not the entire story. But without this, it's hard to understand, right, the outrage, the senselessness, and the injustice of the false complaints 10 years ago and all that they destroyed, and of the smear campaign, which is a natural extension and continuation of the false complaints from 10 years ago. Reich himself was persecuted terribly. He wrote about sexuality, he wrote about Eros. And in the end, there were two critical articles about him which came out in the magazines, The New Republic and Harper's, in 1947. Right afterwards, the United States Food and Drug Administration moved in and obtained an injunction against him on the grounds of fraud for the interstate shipment, right, of one of his devices, which he used in therapy. He persisted with his work and was charged with contempt and sentenced to 2 years in prison. A little bit afterwards, there was a court order and more than 6 tons of his publications were burned. And Reich ended up dying in prison a year later of heart failure. So this is the Reich, right, the renegade student of Freud, who writes about the murder of Christ. Now, I know that the mockers, the haters will say, look, Gafni's saying he's Christ. But of course, that's not what I'm saying. And that's not the intention at all. Right? Reich is talking about Christ in the sense of Eros. And by Eros, he means life force. He means commitment. He means devotion. He means life energy. He means aliveness. And the desire to murder aliveness, which moves us often to try and murder leadership. Those who feel small, those who feel threatened, dress up their sense of feeling small, their sense of feeling threatened in noble sounding motives, and move to murder life force. Reich calls this the emotional plague. And allow me to read you a little bit of Reich's writing in the 14th chapter, right, of his book, The Murder of Christ, where he talks about true meaning. And again, let me just say one last time, by Christ we don't refer to a Christian idea, right? We refer to life force. That's how Reich's using the term, right? To life energy, right? To aliveness. Quote, when the emotional plague, and the emotional plague is what I would term the underlying dynamics and psychology of the smear campaign that we've experienced over the last decade. When the emotional plague strikes its victim, it strikes hard and fast. It strikes without mercy or regard for truth or facts or anything else except one thing: to kill the victim. There are public prosecutors who act as true lawyers, establishing the truth by evidence from many sources. However, there are other prosecutors whose only goal of the prosecution is killing the victim, no matter whether right or wrong, just or unjust. And this is the murder of Christ, the murder of life force, the murder of aliveness today, as it was 2,000 and 4,000 years ago. When the emotional plague strikes, its victim is exposed to everybody's eyes and judgment, which is precisely how I felt the last 7-8 months. All accusations against it are spread out in full daylight. The victim stands naked before its judges like a deer in the open clearing in a forest, ready to be shot by the hunter, well hidden in the bushes. Parentheses, let me add here, this is what we talk about on this website, which we call the anatomy of a smear. Who's shooting from the bushes? What are the true motivations? What's actually happening behind the scenes? And parentheses, let me now go back to Reich's quote. The real accuser rarely appears on the scene. His identity is kept secret until very shortly before the final kill. There exists no law to punish the sniper from the ambush. And I would add, there exists no law to punish those who instigate, who catalyze false complaints, those who instigate and catalyze smear campaigns, and all of the damage that they do, and all of the anguish and trauma and horror that they cause. I'm going back to Reich's quote. To be standing in the middle of an open clearing in a dense forest, widely visible to everyone, and to be shot out from the bushes on all sides is the situation of the victim of the emotional plague, no matter what form it has. When the emotional plague strikes, justice quietly recedes, weeping. There is nothing in the ancient books for justice to call upon to prevail. The sentence of death is perfected before the investigation of the crime. The true motive of the prosecution never meets the cleaning force of God's daylight. The reason for the killing remains in the bushes, well hidden from anybody's eyes. When you meet the accused, but not the accuser, the charge, but not the defense, the exact point of formal law, but not the true reason for the accusation, you are dealing with a killing by the plague. When the plague kills, it kills for wretched reasons. Therefore, to assure the murder, it will not permit weighing the accusation against the true, full being of the victim. It will tear down the victim's honor, besmirch every bit of innocent intention or act. It will pronounce innocuous details in a tone and with a slant of intonation, which is meant to kill the last vestige of love or esteem for the victim in the hearts of the most devoted friends. Let me say it again. It will tear down the victim's honor, besmirch every bit of innocent intention or act. It will pronounce innocuous details in a tone and with a slant of intonation, which is meant to kill the last vestige of love or esteem for the victim in the hearts of most devoted friends. When you hear the deadly, poisonous intonation of the prosecutor, you know a murder of Christ is going to happen again. And let me now add, in parentheses, Mark talking, feel the quality of malice, right, of hatred in the internet posts, most of them made by people who I don't know. Most of the people signing on to petitions of malice made by the people of malice, who I don't know, who I've never met, who I've never checked information. Some of them innocently signing on to internet activism against abuse, but you can feel the core source of the perpetration, dripping with venom, malice, and hatred. And malice, as you know, must never admit of itself, as Milan Kundera told us. So it must always plead other motives. I return now to Reich's direct quote. Together with the exclusion of justice from the court of justice, the victim is rendered mute and helpless. What you see in the victim is a gentle face, a sad, helpless look in his eyes. When you see that in the victim, you may be sure that another murder of Christ is about to be committed. True justice, operating according to the laws of life and truth, does not tear down the victim's honor. It tries to understand how it came about that a son of God, and all men and women are sons and daughters of God, got himself into the predicament of being brought to the court in the first place. True justice will find the particular setting of living life in which any man or woman may have violated an existent law. True justice will even judge the very law it's about to apply. Does it fit the cause? How old is the law? When and under what conditions was it made? And who was it who made the law? Are the conditions still valid that created such a law? Were there specific reasons at the time of the making of the law which are no longer alive, or valid today? When you meet a court which does not judge the law itself, which is to be applied in a living case of human fate, which does not ask for its history, its function, its maker, the reasons for its existence at the time of the new application, you are dealing with a potential or actual tool of the plague, which is intent on committing another murder of Christ. And what Reich says in those last two paragraphs is, when there's a mindless application of conventional ideas, without regard to context, without regard to inner intent, without regard to what the actual situation was, what the actual inner texture of the relationships were, what the actual nature of the dynamics were. When you ignore the specific but you use confirmation bias in order to claim that this is another story, for example, of a teacher, right, abusing students, for example, a corporate head, a leader, right, being corrupt. You use that confirmation bias to apply, right, categories which don't apply, to distort, to evade fact-checking, to evade true integrity and true justice. Then you have a murder of Christ. And again, by Christ we mean life energy, integrity, aliveness, goodness. When I read this passage from Reich, first a decade ago, and again a year ago, and again several months ago, my heart was ripped open again and again, and I thanked Reich. And I thank Reich for capturing this. He knew it because he understood it. King David in Psalms chapter 4 understands it in a very similar way. Rabim kamu alai. Right? Many have risen against me. David is not talking from paranoia or from a sense of a conspiracy theory. David's talking from the tragedy of his lived experience. And he goes on to detail in Psalms a very similar description to Reich, of the murder of life force, of the hidden intentions of malice. And so I invite us, right, in this website to actually resurrect the murder of Eros, to resurrect the murder of life force, to stand against what Reich called the murder of Christ. I urge myself, I demand from myself, I invite you with all my heart, with all my soul, to say no to this emotional plague, to say no to the hidden motivations, to the ulterior agendas, to the base intention, right, to the malice, right, to the envy, to the greed, to the grenvy. Let's actually stand for integrity. Let's stand for truth. Let's stand for justice. Let's stand for transformation. I'm willing to sit with anyone at any time who's willing to take mutual responsibility, who's willing to check facts, who's willing to give up being right. What's my impossible dream? My impossible dream is that we give this up, that we sit together, that we remember that we loved each other, that we actually realize that the response to outrageous pain is outrageous love, that we all hurt each other, and we do it again. Remember Bono and his song. What would it mean to the world if those of us who talk about truth and reconciliation in the most brutal conflict regions in the world, Israel and Palestine, Rwanda, South Africa, but yet when it comes to our own community, we engage in brutality. We engage in the worst dimensions of human aggressiveness, of human evil, of human baseness. What if we in our community, and in the community of spirit, could say, let's give up being right, let's climb down the tree. We've all made mistakes. Let's come together. Let's model what transformation means. That's my impossible dream, and I offer it to you. But in order for that to ever happen, and even if it never happens, we first need to restore integrity and speak the truth. And that's what this website's about. Thank you.